What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas. I hope you're all having a good holiday season, full of plenty of Christmas horror movies, of course. But today I'll be reviewing one of the most iconic slashers of all time, which is Black Christmas from 1974. So Black Christmas has inspired so many things we've seen in movies like Halloween, Friday the 13th, and so many other movies, especially in the slasher genre. Story even has it that the director of Black Christmas, Bob Clark, had a conversation after Black Christmas came out with John Carpenter. And John Carpenter was essentially like, hey, are you going to make a sequel? And Bob Clark was kind of like, I'm kind of done with horror, but... And then John Carpenter was kind of just like, well, if you were going to make a sequel, what kind of a sequel would you make? And he was like, well, maybe, a guy escaping from a mental institution, yada, yada, yada. And John Carpenter was like, that sounds interesting. And I'm sure to all of you, that sounds very, very similar to a movie we would call Halloween, the original Halloween. So yes, you will notice if you've seen this movie, there are so many things in this movie that clearly inspired movies like Halloween and so many others, like I mentioned before, the POV shots and just so many things like the atmosphere, the kills, and just how kind of the movie makes you feel in a way. But anyways, enough of all that. Let's kind of run down the plot of Black Christmas 1974. Black Christmas follows a group of sorority sisters who receive some of the creepiest phone calls you can imagine during Christmas break from school. Some of the sorority sisters are then murdered by a loony hiding in their attic. All right, now first I want to get into some of the positives in the movie. And to me, the intro hooks me in right away. I really, really enjoy the intro with the Christmas music, the creepy POV shots of somebody clearly like sneaking into the sorority house. And then we get that whole suffocation kill with Claire. She's up in the attic. We get those iconic shots of her in the bag and just that whole sequence. I mean, even to today, we're like pretty damn numb to this kind of stuff. It still creeps me out till today. And it's a very, very iconic shot. And it's such a cool way to start off the movie. And it just really, really hooked me right in right away. And the next positive that I want to mention are the kills in this movie. And this movie definitely isn't the goriest movie you'll ever see, but there's a lot of variety to the kills in this movie. And there's a lot of creepiness in the impulsive way that the killer goes about killing people in this movie. They kind of just reactionarily grab something nearby, not planned out at all clearly. And there's just something very, very scary about that. Clearly, if the killer had this whole thing planned out, they probably would have showed up to the house with something, that would work very well to kill people. But in this movie, it's not like that. It's just kind of a person who's just off their rocker, who goes into this house and just starts doing crazy shit. And there's something just very, very scary about that. Next, I want to talk about the characters in the movie. And we've got John Saxon, who's a really good actor and a horror icon, of course, especially after Nightmare on Elm Street. But he does a really good job playing that kind of sharp cop who's on top of his game, kind of leading the other cops who are kind of screwing things up along the way. Just does a really good job in that role. We've got Jess, who plays kind of the main final girl, who's very, very likable. She's got a lot of things on her mind throughout the movie, but still really, really cares about her friends and what potentially might have happened to them, regardless of what's happened in her personal life, which is something very, very redeemable. We've also got Mrs. Mac, who's kind of like the house mother, I guess you could say in a way. She's funny. She kind of adds a light touch to the movie. Every movie kind of needs that a little comedic aspect to it, and I think she does a really good job. I was a little sad, spoiler, when she passed away in the movie earlier than I would have hoped. I would have hoped that she would have given us more comedic lines a little bit later on in the movie, but she was a good character, so I had to mention her as well. Another positive for me is definitely how little they show the killer in this movie. I think that's pulled off really, really, really well. Most of my horror movies, I like that when the killer's kept mostly in the shadows and kind of kept off screen a lot of the time. It just makes you use your mind more, you know what I mean? And that's just another indicator on how this movie influenced Halloween, because Michael Myers usually creeps through the shadows and you don't see a ton of him throughout, especially the original Halloween, which makes his character very, very creepy. In the beginning of the Halloween movie, he's very, very far away. You can kind of see what he's wearing, the mask, sort of, but not really. And then as the movie goes on and on and on, you see closer and closer and closer and get more of his character until the very end. And in this movie, they just do a very good job just not showing too much of the killer. They show little bits of the killer through peepholes and cracks in the door, and that especially that iconic shot, of course, of the killer with the ice sculpture hanging over, showing just like a little shadow of one of the killer's eyes. I mean, you can tell that it's a guy, but still, who is this person? What does he look like? What is he doing this? Is he, Jess's boyfriend? Who is this person? They keep that very, very mysterious. And another spoiler, if you haven't seen the movie, click away. But at the very, very end, I think originally I was very mixed when I first saw this movie on the fact that they never show us who the killer is. But as time goes on, I actually really, really enjoy that. You never really find out who's behind everything. And there's just something scary about that, and I think makes this movie even more iconic. And even though this movie is damn near 50 years old, I think there's some shots and just sequences in this movie that are done really, really well and are unique even to today. Like, there's a lot of shots in this movie I would love to see in movies today. You've got that shot, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, where the killer's holding the ice sculpture above his head, and you can just see just a little crack of his eye. Very creepy, like such an iconic shot. You can kind of see when he's actually killing the person. You got the shot through the ice sculpture and stuff like that. But there's a lot of like angles and different places where they place the camera that makes this movie feel very, very creepy. And a lot of things that I wish they would use today. It was definitely ahead of its time on the way that they shot the movie, and I just think it's amazing. I really, really enjoy it. I'm also just a big fan of the aesthetic of this movie and just the way that 70s horror movies look in general. There's just something scary about them. I mean, the 80s are definitely great, but I would say the 70s and the 80s, to me, I go back and forth on which like kind of look of that era I prefer for my horror movies. But there's just something really, really scary about horror movies in the 70s that just kind of creep you out. Another positive for me is I just think the original Black Christmas is a scary movie. I already mentioned earlier kind of the way the movie's shot, the ambience of the movie, the way the killer is pulled off, and all those things are very, very creepy. But this movie is also not about supernatural things. It's not about aliens. It's not about monsters. It's a very believable story. This guy in the 70s who's got some weird motive that creeps into a sorority house and kills sorority girls. I mean, you can't help but think about Ted Bundy when you watch this movie. And anytime you've got a story like that of a real serial killer that's so similar, it makes the movie just that much more scary because you're like, it actually did happen in real life. But there's just something about this movie that's very, very creepy. And even to today, I still think is pretty damn scary. I'm also a sucker for whodunit plots. I love them. And in this movie, they do a really good job not giving you too much information. Really, till the very end of this movie, literally the last second of this movie, you're still wondering who did all this. And it kind of just keeps you engaged throughout the entire movie because you want to see the reveal potentially at the end. And the last positive that I want to mention has some spoilers in it, so beware of that, but it's just the ending to the movie, which I think is really, really good. Basically, the point where Jess meets the killer, that point forward is really, really intense, that whole basement sequence. And then also the twist where we find out that the killer is still alive. And I just think that whole sequence at the very, very end with the Christmas music and the phone starts ringing is brilliant to me and such a good way to end this movie. And now let's get into some of the negatives in the movie to me. And this movie does, in my opinion, just have a lot going on at times and almost too much at times. Now, this might be a little bit of a nitpick, but you've got like Claire missing. They're looking for her. There's another little girl missing that they're looking for. Claire's also like talking about these really heavy topics with her boyfriend, with abortion and all that kind of stuff. And then also her boyfriend's like proposing to her. There's just a lot going on. Now, you could say that's a positive because it makes this movie have like all these intertwining storylines, and it's not just like a shallow slasher where people are getting naked and killed. Yes, you could say that, but I do think at times they try a little bit too hard to have all these different storylines happening, and here and there is a just kind of a bit much. So I do want to point that out as a negative to me. Now, the next negative that I want to mention is a little bit of a nitpick, admittedly, but I do wish this movie had a little bit more of a Christmas feel to it. There's really only two major parts that really make you feel like it's Christmas time. I wish they just put in like a little bit more. Like I said, that's a bit of a nitpick, but For me, that would just make it more likely that I would put this movie on during the holidays. There are times during this movie where you really don't even feel like at all like it's Christmas, other than the fact that it's clearly very, very cold. I just wish there was a little bit more of a Christmas vibe in this movie, but like I said, that's a bit of a nitpick there. I also did find it slightly unbelievable that nobody noticed that the killer was in the attic. I mean, the killer's clearly moving around up there, doing all kinds of things. This house is clearly pretty old. No creaks in the floor. You're not hearing anything, nothing like that. Somebody probably would have suspected something. I mean, that was a little bit unbelievable. Also, the killer up in the attic talking on the phone really, really loud. Nobody hears anything at all. A little bit of a negative for me. I was kind of, wondering about that while I was watching the movie. Not a big deal, but I would put that down as a negative. And the last negative that I want to mention are some things that happen towards the end of the movie. And are these the worst cops? I mean, they just leave Jess there in the bed without even sweeping the entire house after everything that went down. The killer's still up there with 2 dead bodies. Plus, nobody sees Claire's dead body with a bag over her head out the window. Not a neighbor, nobody during the day at all. Nothing. I mean, I don't really know how long it takes to make, for a dead body to stink, which is probably a good thing, right? But wouldn't these bodies kind of smell by now? Somebody would maybe notice something. But I just had to point that out because throughout the movie, you're like, these cops have no idea what they're doing. And then the end of the movie just further just emphasizes that. So that was kind of a negative for me. All right, here are my final thoughts on Black Christmas 1974. I like this movie. I think this movie has a lot of things in it that are way ahead of its time. I like the killer in this movie, how little they show the killer, like I mentioned. I like the kills in this movie. Yeah, it's not the goriest, like I said, but that doesn't matter to me. It's just the sequences on how they all go down, the variety of the ways that the people die in this movie. And I just think it's really pulled off really, really well. The horror in this movie is done really well. It's got some Christmas vibes to it. We always need more Christmas horror movies, so that's great. And there's also some comedy trickled in here and there. I just really, really enjoyed this movie, and there's a reason why this movie is very, very iconic. I think it definitely deserves more credit than it gets. So definitely go out and watch Black Christmas during this holiday season. Highly recommend it. I've not seen the remake and sequels, so I can't recommend those or anything like that. I've heard mixed things about them, but the original, definitely go out and watch it this holiday season. Thanks everybody for watching my review of Black Christmas. I'll go ahead and link a Halloween video for you as well right next to me right here if you want to check that out. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel because I'll have a ton more holiday horror Christmas themed content coming later this month as well. So you want to subscribe so you don't miss any of that. But anyways, everybody, I will see you in the next one.